The wind was the first thing and the last thing, the only constant in this high, lonesome valley. It was born somewhere over the jagged teeth of the distant mountains and died 100 miles east on the endless plains. But here, in Calder Reed's pocket of the world, it lived its most violent life. It scoured the land, peeling paint from his small cabin, worrying the shingles on the barn, and sending sheets of ochre dust swirling against the gray-green sage. It was a sculptor of loneliness, and in the year of our Lord 1876, it had carved Calder's face into a mask of stoic resignation. He rode his dun mare, Daisy, along the spine of a ridge that overlooked his modest herd of longhorns. The cattle were restless, their heads low against the ceaseless gale, their hides plastered with fine grit. Calder was just as restless. The wind always did this to him. It clawed at the quiet grief he kept locked inside, rattling it like a loose shutter in a storm. It had been 2 years since he'd buried Sarah, 2 years since the silence in his cabin had become a physical weight. And still, the wind sounded like her screaming his name, or maybe it was just his own soul, howling back at the emptiness. He pulled his hat down low, his eyes scanning the horizon not for trouble, but out of a habit so deeply ingrained it was like breathing. In this land, a man who didn't watch the horizon was a man already dead. He saw the usual, the hazy smudge of the Ruby Mountains, the circling of a hawk on an updraft, the shimmer of heat rising from the valley floor even as the afternoon sun began its descent. And then he saw something else, a splash of faded calico, crumpled and still, near the base of the sheer rock face that marked the western edge of his property. It wasn't a coyote, and it wasn't a dead calf. It was the wrong shape, the wrong color. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He nudged Daisy with his heels, and the mare, sensing his urgency, picked her way carefully down the treacherous slope. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman. She was lying face down, a tangle of dark hair spilling into the dust, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Calder swung down from his saddle, his rifle in his hand before his boots hit the ground. He approached cautiously, his steps silent. He'd seen traps laid with less care, but there was no ambush, only the keening of the wind and the unnerving stillness of the figure on the ground. He knelt, nudging her shoulder gently with the barrel of his rifle. "Ma'am?" There was no response. He holstered the rifle and rolled her over. The sight made him draw a sharp breath. Her face was a ruin of bruises, purple and yellow blooming across one cheekbone, her lips split and swollen. Her dress, a simple blue calico, was torn at the shoulder and hem, and her wrists were bound tight with a length of rough hemp rope, the skin beneath rubbed raw and bloody. She was unconscious, but her breathing was shallow, a faint flutter in her chest. For a long moment, Calder did nothing. He was a man who had built his life around solitude, a fortress against further pain. This woman was trouble. Trouble had a scent, and she was drenched in it. Trouble was a locked door he had no desire to open. Every instinct screamed at him to get back on his horse, ride away, and let the wilderness handle its own affairs. It had a way of sorting things out. But then he saw the faint tremor of her eyelashes against her bruised cheek, a flicker of life that refused to be extinguished. He saw the raw, brutalized flesh of her wrists, and a cold, hard anger rose in him, an emotion he hadn't felt so keenly in years. It was an old, familiar feeling, the kind that had once defined him before grief had sanded him down to a nub of existence. He couldn't leave her, whatever she was, whatever she'd done. No one deserved this. With a sigh that seemed to be pulled from the very soles of his worn boots, he pulled out his knife and sliced through the rope binding her hands. He worked with an economy of motion, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he untangled the fibers from her skin. Then, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her to Daisy, mounted, and settled her in front of him, her head lolling against his shoulder. As he urged the mare towards the distant silhouette of his ranch, he felt like he was carrying not just a woman, but a whole world of unknown danger back to the one place he'd thought was safe. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the unfamiliar feel of a soft wool blanket against her skin. For a moment, she thought she was dead. Then the pain returned, a dull, throbbing ache in her head, a sharp sting on her wrists, a fire in her ribs with every breath. She blinked her eyes open, and the world swam into focus. She was in a small, rustic cabin. The walls were rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within. A man sat at a simple wooden table in the center of the room, his back to her, cleaning a rifle. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty denim and a faded flannel shirt. He moved with a quiet, deliberate focus that was somehow intimidating. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her pain. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back onto the cot. The movement, slight as it was, caught his attention. He turned his head, and she saw his face. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with a square jaw shadowed by a few days of stubble. But his eyes were a startlingly clear shade of blue, and in their depths, she saw a weariness that mirrored her own. "Easy now," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough like gravel. "You've been out for a few hours." He stood and walked over to the cot, holding a tin cup. "Water." She struggled to push herself up on her elbows, her whole body screaming in protest. He knelt beside the cot, slipping a hand behind her shoulders to help her. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet the simple human contact made tears spring to her eyes. She drank greedily, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "Who did this to you?" The question hung in the air between them. Her mind raced, a chaotic jumble of terror and desperation. She could lie. She could invent a story about bandits on the trail. But looking into those steady, discerning eyes, she knew a lie would be sniffed out and she'd be cast back into the wilderness. The truth was her only currency, terrifying as it was. "A man," she whispered, her voice cracking. "From Red Bluff. His name is Silas Croft." Calder's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition. Maybe. The name carried weight, even out here. "He's a merchant," she continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. My husband, Jacob, he passed from fever last spring. We owed Mr. Croft money, a lot of money. Jacob had a bad run of luck with the farm." She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket. "Mr. Croft came to collect. He said the debt could be forgiven. He said he would take me as payment, that I would be his wife." Calder remained silent, letting her speak. "I refused, but he has the law in his pocket, and no one would listen to me. He dragged me to the justice of the peace. It was a forced ceremony. I ran. The night before he meant to finalize the arrangement. His men caught me. They were bringing me back when I managed to break free. Near the cliffs." Her voice broke on a sob. "I just ran. I don't know how long." She finally dared to look at him again, her eyes pleading. "I have nowhere else to go. He will hunt me. Please, I'm not a thief. My name is Ada Fairchild." Calder stood up and walked back to the table, picking up the rifle again. Though he didn't work on it, he stared into the fire, his back a rigid wall of muscle. The cabin was filled with the sound of the crackling logs and the ever-present moan of the wind outside. He was a man wrestling with himself, and Ada knew her fate was being decided in that silence. He had promised himself a quiet life. He had paid for it with blood and tears. Sarah's death had been a brutal lesson in the cruelty of fate, a mystery the local sheriff had dismissed as an accident, a fall from that very same ridge where he'd found Ada. But Calder knew better. He knew it was no accident, and the not knowing, the not having anyone to hold accountable, had hollowed him out. He had retreated from the world, from its complications and its false promises. And now, a complication had washed up on his shore, bruised and broken and begging for sanctuary. He turned to face her. His face was grim. "I'm a widower, Mrs. Fairchild. I live alone. I keep to myself for a reason. I can't take on your fight." Ada's heart sank. The hope that had flickered to life within her began to die. "But," he continued, his voice low, "I won't turn you out like this. Not tonight. You can stay in the old stable. It's dry, and there's hay. I'll bring you food. But just until you're strong enough to travel. Then you have to be on your way. Is that understood?" It wasn't the salvation she'd prayed for, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. It was a roof. It was a promise of safety, however temporary. A wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy washed over her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Thank you. God bless you, sir." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if batting away her gratitude. "My name's Calder. Calder Reed. Get some more rest. I'll be back with some broth." He turned and left the cabin, shutting the door firmly behind him, leaving her alone with the fire, the pain, and the fragile, flickering ember of a new beginning. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Calder was a man of few words, and Ada, accustomed to brutality, found his silence a comfort. He kept his promise, setting her up in the small, clean stable adjacent to the barn. It was sparse, but it was a space of her own, a fortress against the world she'd fled. True to his word, he brought her meals, simple stews and fresh-baked bread that tasted of sustenance and a quiet, grudging kindness. As her bruises began to fade from violent purples to mottled greens and yellows, and the strength returned to her limbs, Ada found she couldn't remain idle. She was a woman used to work, and the helplessness of her situation chafed at her. One morning, she intercepted him as he brought her breakfast. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice still a little shaky but firmer than it had been. "I can't just sit here and take your charity. Let me earn my keep. I can cook, I can mend, I can clean." Calder looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her face. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the proud set of her jaw. He saw a survivor, not a victim. He gave another one of his curt nods. "The kitchen's in the cabin. Don't touch my wife's things." It was a stark, painful boundary, but one Ada understood. She found the kitchen to be as Spartan and functional as the man himself, but it was clean, and the pantry was reasonably stocked. She set to work, the familiar motions of kneading dough and chopping vegetables a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. That evening, when Calder came in from a long day of mending fences on the north pasture, the cabin was filled with the warm, inviting scent of roasting chicken and herbs. A clean cloth was laid on the table. He stopped in the doorway, momentarily taken aback. He ate in silence, but she noticed he took a second helping. From then on, a new routine was established. She took over the household chores, cooking, laundry, tending the small vegetable patch behind the cabin. He continued his relentless work on the ranch, rounding up strays, hauling water, and standing watch at night with his rifle, his silhouette a dark, protective shape against the starry sky. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the immediate needs of the day. "The well pump is sticking," or "We're low on flour." But in their shared labor, a silent communication began to grow. She saw the deep exhaustion in his shoulders at the end of the day. He saw the fear that still lingered in her eyes, the way she would startle at any sudden noise. They were two solitary planets, orbiting the same sun of survival, keeping a careful distance but acutely aware of each other's pull. One evening, the heat was stifling, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a distant storm. Ada was on the porch, mending one of Calder's shirts by the fading light, when she saw him head towards the well in the center of the yard. He stripped off his shirt, his back a landscape of corded muscle, tanned and scarred by years of hard labor. He hauled up a bucket of cold water and, with a shuddering gasp, poured it over his head. The setting sun broke through the clouds, bathing the scene in a rich, golden light. Water streamed down his hair, his shoulders, his chest, making his skin glisten. In that moment, he didn't look like a grieving recluse or a grim protector. He looked powerful, elemental, a man carved from the very earth he worked. He turned to reach for another bucket, and his eyes met hers across the yard. The world seemed to stop. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the ever-present wind. It all faded into a deafening silence. Ada's breath caught in her throat. His gaze was intense, unguarded for the first time, and in it she saw a flash of something she hadn't expected, a deep, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. Her cheeks flushed, and a strange, unfamiliar flutter took flight in her stomach. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. She looked down quickly at the shirt in her lap, her fingers fumbling with the needle. When she dared to look up again, he was gone. The wet earth around the well, the only evidence he'd been there at all. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. They ate their dinner in a more charged silence than usual. Afterwards, Calder sat at the table, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass before him. He poured a measure and stared into the amber liquid as if searching for answers. This was his ritual. She had learned. His nightly communion with his ghosts. Ada retired to the stable, but sleep wouldn't come. The image of him at the well was burned into her mind, the look in his eyes. She felt a desperate urge to break through the wall of silence he had built around himself, to connect with the man beneath the hardened exterior. After an hour of tossing and turning in the hay, she made a decision. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and walked back to the cabin. The door was ajar. She pushed it open softly. He was still there, in the same position, the bottle of whiskey now half empty. He looked up as she entered, his eyes slightly unfocused. "Couldn't sleep," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of his private grief. He didn't tell her to leave. He just stared at her, then gestured with the bottle towards the other chair. "Join me." She hesitated, then sat down opposite him. He slid the glass across the table. She shook her head. "I don't." He grunted and poured himself another drink. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of a small mantel clock she hadn't noticed before. "She loved that clock," Calder said suddenly, his voice thick. "Said the ticking made the silence less lonely. It doesn't." Ada knew he was talking about his wife. "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Sarah," he said, the name a raw wound. She was like a wildflower, bright, tough, belonged in the sun. This valley, it swallowed her up." He took a long drink of whiskey. "They said she fell from the ridge, but Sarah knew those hills better than I do. She wouldn't have just fallen." He looked at Ada, his eyes blazing with a grief so raw it was painful to witness. "I should have been there." "You can't blame yourself," Ada whispered. Though the words felt hollow, she knew the shape of guilt all too well. "I blame myself for Jacob. If I hadn't pushed him to buy more seed, to take the loan from Croft, he wouldn't have worked himself into the ground. He wouldn't have gotten sick." Tears she didn't know she had left began to trace paths through the dust on her cheeks. "He was a good man. He didn't deserve to die, and he would never have wanted me to end up with a man like Croft." For the first time, they weren't rescuer and victim, man and woman. They were just two people, shipwrecked by life, sharing the stories of their scars in the dim, flickering light of a single lantern. Calder reached across the table, his large, calloused hand covering hers. His touch was warm, steady, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pain. "You're safe here, Ada," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The promise was different this time. It wasn't a temporary offer of shelter. It was something more. A bond forged in the quiet hours of a windy night. A fragile connection between two broken souls who had, against all odds, found a moment of grace in each other's loss. The fragile truce born in the lamplight couldn't survive the harsh light of day. Their shared vulnerability had been a bridge across the chasm of their loneliness. But it was a bridge made of moonlight and whiskey, and it dissolved with the morning sun. The air grew thick with unspoken words, heavier than the humid, oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the valley. Calder was more silent than ever, but his quietness was no longer a comfort to Ada. It was a judgment. He avoided her eyes, took his meals quickly on the porch, and spent his days riding the farthest boundaries of his property, as if he could outrun the memory of his hand on hers. Ada felt a crushing weight of shame in her mind. She had not only betrayed the memory of her late husband, Jacob, but she had also trespassed on the sacred ground of Calder's grief for his Sarah. She had taken his grudging kindness and twisted it into something messy and complicated. The work that had once soothed her, baking, cleaning, tending the garden, now felt like a penance. Every corner of the small cabin seemed to hold the echo of their conversation, the ghost of that fleeting, desperate connection. The sky mirrored their turmoil. By the third day, the horizon was a bruised purple, and the clouds gathered in a dark, brooding mass that swallowed the mountains whole. The wind, once a constant moan, began to whip and snarl, tearing at the leaves and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. The cattle huddled together in the low pasture, their plaintive calls lost in the rising gale. Calder came in from the barn, his hat pulled low, his face grim. "Big one's coming," he said. His voice clipped. "We need to get to the cellar." There was no time for awkwardness, only urgency. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry earth with audible splats. A low, menacing rumble echoed from the clouds. Calder grabbed a lantern and a heavy wooden bar for the cellar door. Ada quickly gathered a jug of water, the wool blanket from her cot, and a half loaf of bread, her hands trembling slightly. The sky split open with a blinding flash of lightning, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so violent it shook the cabin to its foundations. "Now, Ada!" Calder yelled over the roar. He wrenched open a thick trap door in the middle of the cabin floor that she had barely noticed before, revealing a set of steep wooden steps leading down into darkness. The air that rose from it was cool and smelled of damp earth and potatoes. He lit the lantern and descended, its yellow glow casting flickering shadows on the stone walls below. Ada followed, her heart pounding in time with the storm. Calder pulled the heavy doors shut from the inside and dropped the thick wooden bar into place. Suddenly, the world was reduced to this small, subterranean space. The roar of the storm was muffled, a distant, terrifying beast trying to claw its way in. The cellar was no more than 10 feet square, the walls lined with shelves holding jars of preserves. Sarah's work, Ada realized with a pang, and sacks of root vegetables. The air was cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat they had just escaped. A shiver ran through Ada that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the chill. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, but it did little to ward off the cold that seemed to seep from the very stones. They stood in opposite corners, the lantern on the floor between them casting their elongated shadows against the walls. The tight space forced a proximity they had been desperately avoiding, making the silence between them even more profound. Hours passed. Above them, the storm raged with apocalyptic fury. The ground trembled with each thunderclap, and they could hear the torrential rain hammering against the cellar doors. The cold deepened, and Ada began to shiver uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. She huddled deeper into the blanket, but the damp chill was relentless. Calder watched her, his face a mask in the flickering light. He had been as still as a statue, lost in his own thoughts. But her visible distress finally broke through his reserve. With a resigned sigh, he moved towards her. "Here," he said, his voice rough. "You'll freeze." He sat on an overturned crate, his back against the wall, and pulled her down to sit beside him, between him and the cold stone. He was still avoiding her eyes. He draped one of his arms around her, pulling the blanket tighter. His intention clearly nothing more than to share his body heat, but the effect was immediate and overwhelming. His nearness was a physical shock. She could feel the solid strength of his chest against her side, the warmth radiating from him a stark contrast to the cellar's cold. She could smell the scent of rain, leather, and the faint, masculine scent of the man himself. Her shivering began to subside, replaced by a different kind of tremor, one that started deep within her. She was acutely aware of the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder, the rough texture of his flannel shirt against her cheek. She tilted her head back, and her gaze met his. The lantern light carved deep shadows on his face, but his eyes were luminous, and in them she saw the storm from outside reflected, a maelstrom of loneliness, grief, and a raw, burgeoning desire that he could no longer hide. The pretense of the last few days was stripped away by the darkness and the forced intimacy of their shelter. "Calder," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He just lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hesitant at first, then deepened with a desperate, pent-up force. A collision of two people starved for contact. It was a kiss that tasted of whiskey and sorrow, and the unspoken things that had hung between them for days. Ada's hands came up to clutch at his shirt, pulling him closer, surrendering to the overwhelming need to feel something other than fear and loss. His hand moved from her shoulder, tangling in her hair, his fingers firm against her scalp. His other arm tightened around her waist, lifting her slightly so she was pressed against him. The kiss broke, and they were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. The world outside, with its thunder and fury, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of their breathing, the smell of the damp earth, and the frantic beating of their own hearts. A current of raw, elemental need passed between them, powerful and undeniable. He laid her back gently onto a pile of burlap sacks, his body covering hers, shielding her from the cold. It was a moment of fierce, unthinking passion, a desperate grasp for life in the face of so much death. His lips traced a path down her throat, and she arched against him, a low sound escaping her lips. But just as the moment was about to consume them completely, he froze. A shudder went through his powerful frame. He pushed himself up abruptly, his face a mess of conflict and regret. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair, his breathing ragged. "I can't," he rasped, his back to her. It's wrong." He was talking about Sarah. Ada knew it as surely as she knew her own name. The ghost of his wife was in the cellar with them, a presence more real and solid than the stone walls. The heat of the moment vanished, replaced by an icy wave of shame that was colder than the cellar air. She sat up, pulling the blanket around herself like a shield, her body trembling anew. She had wanted comfort, and in her weakness, she had desecrated a memory. Calder didn't look at her. He walked to the far side of the cellar and sank to the floor, his head in his hands. The storm still raged outside, but inside their tiny shelter, a new and far more terrible storm had just broken, and its silence was deafening. The dawn came, pale and washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that glistened with moisture and smelled of wet pine and clean earth. But the calm outside was a cruel mockery of the turmoil within the cabin. Calder and Ada emerged from the cellar like strangers, blinking in the bright, unfamiliar light. They didn't speak of what had happened. They didn't need to. It hung between them, a thick, unbreachable wall. Calder became a ghost in his own home. He was up before sunrise and gone, returning only after dark to eat a silent meal and then retreat to the barn, choosing to sleep in the hayloft rather than the cabin. Ada's loneliness returned tenfold, sharper and more painful now that she knew what it felt like, however briefly, to have it assuaged. She was consumed by a quiet, gnawing guilt, replaying the moment in the cellar over and over in her mind. Had she invited it? Had her own desperation been so naked, so shameless? She felt like a fallen woman, a sinner who had taken advantage of a good man's sorrow. It was a week after the storm, on an achingly clear afternoon, that the second cataclysm arrived. It came not in a fury of wind and rain, but in a cloud of dust raised by a rickety hired buggy. Pulled by a sway-backed horse that looked on its last legs, the buggy rattled to a stop in the yard, and a woman descended. She was a splash of garish color against the muted landscape. She wore a dress of emerald green satin, stained and wrinkled from travel, with a neckline that was daringly low for any place west of St. Louis. Her hair was a vibrant shade of auburn, piled high on her head, though several strands had escaped to frame a face that was both beautiful and weary. Her lips were painted a bold crimson, slightly smeared, and her eyes, the same deep brown as Ada's, were shadowed with a fatigue that no amount of kohl could hide. She surveyed the humble ranch with a theatrical sweep of her gaze, one hand on her hip. Ada was on the porch, shaking out a rug, and she froze, the rug slipping from her nerveless fingers. She recognized her instantly. "Maybelle," she whispered, the name a puff of disbelief. The woman's painted smile widened. "In the flesh. Cousin. You're a harder woman to find than a sober man on payday." Maybelle sauntered towards the porch, her movements fluid and confident. A stark contrast to Ada's quiet stillness. She was Ada's younger cousin, the daughter of her mother's sister, a girl who had always been too bright, too loud, too ambitious for their small Pennsylvania town. She had run off years ago with a traveling theater troupe and had only been heard from in sporadic, boastful letters. "What are you doing here?" Ada asked, her voice tight with a mixture of shock and dread. "Seeking refuge, darling, a bit of familial sanctuary," Maybelle said, her voice a husky drawl that held the faint echo of smoky saloons. "Turns out the good folks of Cheyenne have a rather puritanical view on establishments that serve liquor and provide uplifting musical entertainment." She waved a dismissive hand. "A misunderstanding with the local constabulary. They raided the Nightingale, and I made a swift exit out the back. I need a place to lie low for a few weeks, until the dust settles." Just then, Calder rounded the corner of the barn, a woodsman's axe in his hand. He stopped dead, his eyes taking in the flamboyant stranger. Maybelle's gaze swept over him, from his dusty boots to his broad shoulders to his stern, handsome face. A slow, appreciative smile spread across her painted lips. "Well now," she purred, "who is this fine specimen of rustic masculinity?" Calder's eyes narrowed. He looked from Maybelle's audacious costume to Ada's pale, worried face. "Ada, who is this?" "This is my cousin, Maybelle," Ada said, her voice barely audible. She needs a place to stay, just for a little while." Calder's expression hardened. His life, once a model of stark simplicity, had become impossibly complicated in the span of a few weeks. He had one woman hiding from a powerful merchant, and now another, a painted saloon singer, was on his doorstep, running from the law. He looked at Ada, a silent question in his eyes. "Do you trust her?" Ada couldn't bear his gaze. She looked down at her hands. How could she turn away her own blood, her only remaining family? Despite Maybelle's reckless life, they had been close as girls. "Please, Calder, just for a few days." Calder let out a long, slow breath, his jaw tight. He looked at Maybelle, whose smile had not wavered, her eyes sparkling with a challenge. He saw nothing but trouble, wrapped in emerald satin. "The stable is occupied," he said, his voice flat. "You can take a bedroll in the barn. Same rules. Stay out of sight." He turned without another word and strode back towards the wood pile, the axe swinging in his hand. Maybelle watched him go, a low chuckle escaping her lips. "Charming," she murmured to Ada. "Does he ever smile? Or would it crack his face?" She then looked at Ada, her expression softening for the first time. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Addie, what in God's name happened to you? Last I heard, you were a respectable farmer's wife." And so, the fragile, fractured world of two became an unstable, volatile world of three. The tension on the ranch immediately tripled. If Ada was a quiet stream, Maybelle was a flash flood. She filled the silence with her sardonic laughter, her humming of bawdy saloon tunes, and her constant witty commentary on the hardships of rural life. She treated Calder's stoicism not as a wall to be respected, but as a fortress to be besieged. "Good morning, Mr. Solemn," she'd say as he emerged from the barn, her voice dripping with amusement. "Did you wrestle any bears in your sleep?" Calder would just grunt and continue with his work, but Maybelle was relentless. She flirted with him openly, her words a constant, playful barrage that clearly unsettled him. She was everything his Sarah, and indeed Ada, was not worldly, cynical, and utterly without shame. For Ada, Maybelle's presence was a daily torment. Beside her cousin's vibrant, confident personality, Ada felt plain, timid, and hopelessly conventional. Maybelle talked of cities, of men with diamond stick pins, of champagne and applause, a life of dangerous glamour that made Ada's own traumas seem small and pathetic. She watched the way Maybelle's eyes followed Calder, the way she would find excuses to touch his arm, to stand a little too close. A bitter, unfamiliar jealousy began to take root in Ada's heart. She and Calder had shared something profound, something broken and real. Maybelle's flirtations felt like a cheap mockery of it. Maybelle, for her part, saw the dynamic between Calder and Ada with a sharp, perceptive eye. She saw the longing in her cousin's gaze and the rigid way Calder held himself whenever Ada was near. She knew something had happened between them, but Maybelle's life had taught her that survival was a competition. She saw in Calder not just a handsome man, but a protector, a rock, a kind of safety she had never known, and she instinctively moved to secure it for herself. Both widows felt the other's presence as a threat. They were two women clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a vast, unforgiving ocean. The breaking point came one sweltering afternoon a week later. Calder, exhausted from a morning of breaking a wild mustang, had retreated to the relative cool of the stable for a brief rest, stretching out on a fresh pile of hay. Maybelle saw her opportunity. She had changed out of her traveling dress and into something she had saved, a simple gown of black velvet, utterly impractical for a ranch. But it clung to her figure in a way that was anything but simple. She found him with his eyes closed, his hat tipped over his face. "A man of your considerable talents shouldn't be sleeping alone," she said, her voice a low purr. Calder sat up, startled, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip before he realized who it was. "What do you want, Maybelle?" "Just some conversation," she said, sinking down onto the hay beside him, arranging her velvet skirt around her. The scent of a cheap, musky perfume filled the small space. "It gets awfully quiet out here. Don't you ever get lonely?" "I like quiet," he said, his voice tense. "Do you?" she challenged, leaning closer. "Or is that just what you tell yourself? A woman can see the loneliness in a man's eyes. It's a look I know well." Her fingers traced a light pattern on his forearm. His muscles tensed, but he didn't pull away. "Ada is a good woman. She's sweet and kind. She'll offer you comfort for your soul. But sometimes, a man doesn't need his soul comforted. Sometimes he just needs to forget." Her face was inches from his, her crimson lips slightly parted. She was offering him an escape, a physical absolution without the complications of the heart. He looked into her knowing eyes, and for a moment, the weary, grief-stricken man in him was tempted. It would be so easy. a moment of oblivion, a purely physical act to burn away the memory of his failure in the cellar with Ada, to silence the ghost of Sarah that haunted his every waking thought. He leaned forward, his resolve wavering. It was at that exact moment that Ada entered the stable, a bucket of fresh water in her hand for the mare in the next stall. She stopped, frozen in the doorway. The scene before her was stark and undeniable. Her cousin, dressed like a creature of the night, leaning over Calder Reed on a bed of hay, their faces so close they were almost touching. Maybelle looked over her shoulder and saw Ada. A flicker of triumph, quickly masked, crossed her face. Calder jerked back as if he'd been burned, scrambling to his feet, his face a dark cloud of guilt and anger. But it was the look on Ada's face that stopped his heart. It wasn't anger or outrage. It was a look of profound, devastating betrayal. The last fragile thread of hope and trust that had survived the cellar, that had endured the week of agonizing silence, finally snapped. Without a word, she dropped the bucket, the water splashing over her worn boots, and turned and fled. The sound of the dropped bucket was a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. Ada didn't scream or cry. A soundless, wrenching sob tore through her, but she choked it down, turning it into a fuel for a cold, hard rage. She fled not to the cabin, but to the small stable that had been her sanctuary, the first place she had felt a whisper of safety. Now, it was desecrated, the very air thick with betrayal. Her movements were frantic, jerky. She gathered her meager possessions, the spare dress Calder had bought for her from the mercantile, the small, carved bird her father had made her years ago, the brush she'd used to untangle her hair. They were nothing. They were everything. Each item was a reminder of a life she was trying to build from ashes, a life that had just been set ablaze once more. The image from the barn was seared into her mind. Maybelle, a vibrant, predatory flower in her black velvet, leaning over him. And Calder, not pushing her away, leaning in. She heard footsteps approaching, heavy and deliberate. Calder filled the doorway, his large frame blocking out the sun, plunging the stable into shadow. "Ada," he said, his voice low and strained. "It wasn't what it looked like." The classic, useless words of a guilty man. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Wasn't it? It looked like my cousin, a woman I vouched for, was trying to seduce the man who promised me his protection. It looked like you were letting her—" She stuffed the last of her things into a rough burlap sack. "I should have kept running. I should never have stopped here." "Where will you go?" he asked, a raw edge of desperation in his voice that she had never heard before. "Croft's men could still be looking for you." "I'd rather face them than this," she retorted, her voice shaking with a fury that surprised them both. "At least with them. The danger is honest. It doesn't pretend to be kind. It doesn't offer you a safe harbor only to let pirates aboard." She pushed past him, trying to exit the stable, but he moved to block her path, his hand closing gently but firmly on her arm. "Don't go," he said. The words were simple, but they held the weight of a man drowning. "Give me one reason why I should stay," she challenged, her eyes flashing, hot with unshed tears of rage and hurt. "So I can watch you and my cousin play your games, so I can cook your meals and mend your clothes while you disgrace the memory of your wife and make a fool of me." His hand dropped from her arm as if her words had physically struck him. His face, usually a stoic mask, crumbled. The grief and confusion and loneliness of the past 2 years, and the bewildering turmoil of the last few weeks, rose to the surface. "Because you're not the only one," he finally choked out, the admission torn from the deepest part of him. He wasn't looking at her, but at some distant point over her shoulder, as if confessing to a ghost. "Ever since Sarah, I've been dead inside, walking, breathing, but dead, just waiting for the end. And then you came, and I felt—" He struggled for the word, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "And then she came, and it's all a damn mess." and I don't know what's right anymore. But I know that when you're both here, I feel alive again. God help me, I feel alive." The confession hung in the dusty air, raw and shocking in its honesty. It was not a declaration of love, but something far more complicated and painful. It was the sound of a man's soul cracking open. Maybelle appeared in the doorway behind him, her arms crossed, the black velvet of her dress seeming to absorb the light. Her painted smile was gone, replaced by a guarded, watchful expression. "Well," she said, her voice losing its usual theatrical drawl, "that's the most I've heard him say in a week." Ada stared at Calder, his words echoing in her head. Alive. He hadn't chosen. He hadn't decided. He was just feeling. And they, she and Maybelle, were the instruments of his resurrection. Two different notes in a song he was just beginning to hear again. The anger didn't vanish, but it was complicated now by a devastating pang of pity. The three of them stood there, a triangle of pain and want. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, with years of loss and lifetimes of longing. It was Ada who finally broke the silence, her voice trembling but clear. She looked directly at Calder, her gaze unwavering. "We are not medicine for you to take. Calder, we are not tools to make you feel alive." Her voice rose, filled with the force of a woman who had been a commodity for too long, first to her father, then to her husband's debtor, and now, it seemed, to her rescuer. "I've spent my whole life being a shadow in someone else's house, a reflection of what they needed me to be. I will not do it again." She took a step forward, her chin high. "We don't need your safety if it comes at the price of our dignity. We don't need your protection if it means we are just interchangeable parts in your life." Her voice broke, the final, desperate truth tearing from her throat. "We don't need safety. We need to be chosen, not to be shadows in your house." The word struck Calder harder than any physical blow. He saw them then, not as complications or temptations, but as two whole, breathing women, with histories and wounds as deep as his own. He saw the fire in Ada's eyes and the brittle pride in Maybelle's posture, and he felt a shame so profound it burned him from the inside out. Before anyone could say another word, the tense tableau was shattered by the sound of an approaching horse. A man rode into the yard, reining in a sweat-streaked bay. He was wiry and grizzled, with a stained duster and a mean, tea-pinched face. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, scanned the scene, lingering on Ada with a flash of predatory recognition. A coiled rope hung from his saddle, and a heavy colt was strapped low on his hip. "Well, look what we have here," the man said, his voice a greasy drawl. He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling with a sound of pure menace. "Silas Croft pays a handsome price for returned property. I believe you belong to him, Mrs. Fairchild." Ada felt the blood drain from her face. It was one of Croft's men, a bounty hunter named Finch, known for his cruelty. The abstract danger she had been fleeing had just become terrifyingly real. Finch ignored Calder and Maybelle completely, his eyes fixed on Ada as if she were a stray calf to be roped. He took a step towards her. "Come on, now. Let's make this easy." Calder moved so fast he was almost a blur. He stepped in front of Ada, placing his body between her and the bounty hunter. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. Finch chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "This ain't your affair, rancher. Step aside." He reached for his pistol. He never cleared the holster. Calder's own gun seemed to leap into his hand. The explosion was deafening, a shocking crack that sent a flock of birds scattering from the barn roof. Finch cried out, stumbling backward, clutching his right arm where a dark, wet stain was already spreading across the sleeve of his duster. His pistol fell to the dirt. "Now get off my land!" Calder snarled, the pistol still leveled, smoke curling from its barrel. And you tell Silas Croft that if he or any of his men ever set foot here again, they'll be carried off it." Finch stared at Calder, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. Then his gaze shifted to Ada and Maybelle, huddled behind Calder. His mean little eyes narrowed with a new, malicious understanding. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust. "So that's how it is," he sneered. "Playing house with two widows. The preacher's gonna love hearing about this." He clutched his wounded arm, staggered back to his horse, and hauled himself into the saddle. He gave them one last venomous look before kicking his horse into a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust and the ringing silence of violence in his wake. The gunshot had changed everything. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the dirt not just for Silas Croft, but for the whole world. The quiet, isolated life Calder had so desperately clung to was over. News of a shooting traveled faster than a prairie fire, and Finch's venomous parting shot guaranteed that the story would be a lurid one. As the dust settled, Ada was overcome with a wave of guilt so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. This was her fault. She had brought this violence, this danger, to the doorstep of a man who had only shown her kindness. "I have to go," she said, her voice hollow. "I have to leave, now, before I bring any more trouble to you." She looked at Calder, her eyes full of anguish. "You shot a man for me. They'll call it attempted murder. They'll come for you." "Let them," Calder said, his voice grim as he reloaded his pistol, his hands steady. "No," Ada insisted, turning to grab her burlap sack. "I will not be the cause of your ruin." She turned to leave, but this time it was Maybelle who blocked her path. "And where will you go, cousin?" Maybelle asked, her tone sharp and pragmatic. "Back to Croft, or will you just run until you drop in the desert? Don't be a fool." "It's better than staying here and watching him hang for me," Ada cried. Maybelle looked from Ada's desperate face to Calder's resolute one. For a moment, she was silent, the cynical saloon singer weighing her options. She could slip away herself, find another town, another Nightingale saloon. But as she looked at the two of them, she saw something else. She saw two people who were as lost and broken as she was, and she thought of Calder's confession. "I feel alive again." And she thought of the killing loneliness she knew so well, the kind that haunted her in the small hours of the morning when the cheap perfume had worn off, and the applause was a distant memory. "She's right," Maybelle said to Calder, her voice hard. "If she goes, you lose the only reason you have for shooting that son of a bitch. They'll call you a madman, but if she stays, and I stay, and that bastard Finch tells his story." She let the thought hang in the air. A man protecting two helpless women on his property. It's still trouble, but it's a different kind of trouble. She then turned to Ada, her eyes intense. "If you go, I go. There's nothing for me here without the both of you." And then she looked back at Calder, and her next words struck him with the force of a physical blow. "And you," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "You'll be right back where you started. Just you and that killing loneliness. And it will be worse this time, because now you know what it feels like to not be alone." Her words hung in the air, a stark and brutal truth. They were a strange, broken trio, bound together not by love or duty, but by a shared, desperate need. To leave was to surrender not just to Croft or the law, but to the crushing isolation that had nearly destroyed them all. Ada looked at Calder, her resolve wavering. He looked back at her, his expression pleading. In that moment, she knew she couldn't leave him to face the consequences of his actions alone. "What do we do?" she whispered. It was Maybelle, ever the pragmatist, who came up with the plan. "We stay," she said, taking charge. "But we change the story. Finch saw two women. He doesn't know who is who or what our relations are. From now on, we are the Weber sisters. Hired help. You hired us from a town over to cook and clean. It's thin, but it's better than the truth." Calder nodded slowly, the logic of it sinking in. It was a lie, a flimsy shield against the coming storm of gossip and suspicion. but it was all they had. "All right," he agreed. "The Weber sisters." That night, the storm that had been threatening inside finally broke outside. A cold, steady rain began to fall, drumming a somber rhythm on the cabin roof. The violent heat of the afternoon had been replaced by a damp chill that seeped into the logs, into their bones. They sat around the fire, not as a master and his hired help, but as three conspirators, three survivors huddled together against the dark. The whiskey bottle was on the table again, but this time there were 3 glasses. Maybelle poured a small amount for herself and Ada, and a larger one for Calder. They drank in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Maybelle who spoke first, her voice low and stripped of its usual bravado. "He reminded me of a man I knew in Kansas City," she said, staring into the fire. "Owned a place called the Gilded Cage. He was all smiles and diamond rings out front, but in the back, he had a temper. He liked his girls to be grateful." She took a sip of whiskey, her knuckles white around the glass. "One night, I dropped a tray of drinks. He dragged me into his office. He told me that my voice, my face, my body, it all belonged to him, that he had paid for it, and he was going to collect." She fell silent, but the story hung in the air, ugly and unfinished. Ada could picture it all, the fear, the humiliation. She reached out and placed a hand on her cousin's arm. Maybelle didn't pull away. A single tear traced a path through the faint remnants of her face powder. "I hit him with a whiskey bottle and ran out the back. That's when I learned how to disappear, how to become someone else." The confession cracked open the space between them, making it safe for other truths to emerge. Ada found herself speaking, her voice a near whisper, sharing a secret she had never told a soul, not even her own mother. "The night I married Jacob," she began, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I was so scared. He was a kind man, but he was large and clumsy. He had been drinking with my father to celebrate. He didn't mean to be rough. He just didn't know his own strength." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "The next morning, the sheets were bloody. Not from what you'd expect. From the way he held me down. My shoulder was bruised for a week. He cried when he saw what he'd done. He never touched me with anything but gentleness again. But every night, for years, when he'd roll over to hold me, I would flinch." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. "I loved him, but I was always afraid, and I have felt guilty for that fear every day since he died." The cabin was utterly silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the steady drumming of the rain. 2 stories of pain, of men who took what they wanted, of what it meant to be a woman in a world that saw you as property. Calder hadn't said a word. He had listened to both stories, his face impassive, but his eyes were filled with a terrible, empathetic pain. He had lived his life by a simple code of strength and protection, yet he had failed to protect Sarah, and he saw now, with blinding clarity, the 1,000 ways the world failed to protect women like Ada and Maybelle. His own grief felt selfish in the face of their trauma. What words could he offer? What comfort could a man like him, a creature of the same world that had produced Silas Croft and the owner of the Gilded Cage, possibly give? There were no words. So he did the only thing he could. He reached out, his large, calloused hands covering theirs where they rested on the table. He didn't speak. He just held on, his thumbs gently stroking their skin. He held the hand of the saloon singer who had forgotten what a gentle touch felt like, and he held the hand of the farmer's wife who had learned to fear it. He held them both, 2 trembling, ice-cold hands, and slowly, with the warmth from his own, he began to make them steady. The gunshot had cleared the air, but the silence that followed was heavy with consequence. The lie they had concocted, the Weber sisters, hired from a town over, became their new, fragile reality. It was a flimsy shield, and all 3 of them knew it. Every passing rider, every distant plume of dust on the horizon, brought a fresh spike of anxiety. They were living on a knife's edge, a household of outlaws bound by secrets and a shared, unspoken need. The days that followed were a strange mixture of tension and tenderness. The tension was a low hum beneath everything they did, the constant awareness of their precarious situation, of the gazes of the two women on the one man, of the unspoken feelings that swirled between them like the ever-present dust. But the tenderness was there too, blooming in the small, quiet moments of their shared existence, like desert wildflowers after a rare rain. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. There was a rhythm in the way Ada's hands moved, kneading dough in the pre-dawn quiet, her movements a graceful, comforting constant. There was a rhythm to the thud of Calder's axe as he split wood, a steady, powerful heartbeat for their small world. And there was a new rhythm from Maybelle, who would hum old, melancholic saloon ballads as she mended clothes, her stitches surprisingly neat and even, her voice a thread of worldly sorrow weaving through the rustic peace. One week, the corn was ready for harvest. They worked together under the hot, relentless sun, moving through the rustling rows. Calder, with his raw strength, would snap the stalks, while Ada and Maybelle followed, stripping the husks and tossing the golden ears into a large wooden cart. They didn't speak much, but a silent language developed between them, a shared look when a particularly large ear was found, the simple act of Calder passing the water canteen to Maybelle, and her passing it to Ada. In the shared sweat and labor, some of the tension between them seemed to melt away, burned off by the sun. Another afternoon, as they were all in the kitchen, washing up after the midday meal, a sudden cacophony erupted from the yard. It was a frantic bleating and a crash of splintering wood. The small herd of goats Calder kept for milk and brush clearing had broken through the fence of Ada's precious vegetable garden. They rushed outside to a scene of pure chaos. A large billy goat was standing triumphantly atop a crushed pumpkin, while two smaller nannies were methodically devouring her tomato vines. Calder started shouting, trying to herd them, which only made them scatter further. Ada let out a cry of despair, seeing weeks of hard work being destroyed in minutes. But then Maybelle, her skirts hitched up, dove into the fray with a wild whoop. She grabbed a broom from the porch and began shooing the goats with a theatrical flair, yelling at them as if they were unruly patrons at the Nightingale. "Get on now, you bearded demons! The salad bar is closed!" The sight of the sophisticated Maybelle, in her slightly too fine dress, brandishing a broom and arguing with a goat was so absurd that Ada's despair dissolved into a bubble of laughter. The laugh, when it came, was a pure, unburdened sound, something none of them had heard from her before. Her laughter set Calder off, a deep, rumbling chuckle that seemed to startle even himself. Soon, all three of them were leaning against the broken fence, weak with a shared, cleansing laughter as the goats, sensing defeat, trotted away indignantly. In that moment, they were not a grim widower and two desperate women. They were just three people laughing at a goat. The sound of it was more healing than any words could ever be. But the quiet moments were just as powerful. In the evenings, after the work was done, Ada would sit on the porch with a strange new project. From the mercantile. Calder had bought her a length of simple, cream-colored muslin, along with skeins of white silk thread, and now, by the fading light, she was embroidering it. She was stitching tiny, intricate flowers, columbines, and Indian paintbrushes along the hem of what was unmistakably a dress, a simple, unadorned gown, a wedding dress. Calder would watch her sometimes from the barn doorway, a knot of confusion and a strange, unidentifiable ache in his chest. No one had asked her to marry him. No one had spoken of such things. Yet, there she sat, stitching her hope into the plain fabric, as if she could create a future with her own two hands. It was an act of faith so quiet and so profound that it unnerved him. It was a claim, and he didn't know if he was worthy of it. Maybelle, too, had her own ways of reaching across the divide. She saw the way Calder moved, always rigid, his shoulders burdened with a weight that was more than just physical labor. She saw a man who had forgotten how to be anything other than a guardian, a worker, a mourner. One night, after Ada had retired to the stable, Maybelle lit an extra lantern in the main room of the cabin. Calder was cleaning his rifle at the table, his nightly ritual. "You move like you're made of stone. Calder Reed," she said, her voice soft, without its usual teasing edge. He grunted, not looking up. "The world makes a man hard." "It doesn't have to," she said. She began to hum a slow, swaying melody, a waltz she had heard 100 times in 100 different dance halls. "My father taught me to dance. He was a gambler and a drunk, but he knew how to waltz. He said it was the only time he ever felt graceful." She stood up and held out a hand. "Come on, let me show you." Calder stared at her hand as if it were a snake. "I don't dance." "I know," she said, her smile gentle. "That's why I have to teach you. A man should know how to hold a woman without breaking her or building a fence around her." He hesitated, a war playing out behind his eyes. It felt like a betrayal of Sarah, a betrayal of his grief. But Maybelle's gaze was steady, not seductive, but kind. He found himself slowly getting to his feet, his movement stiff and awkward. He took her hand, his own large and calloused, swallowing hers completely. She placed his other hand on her waist and rested her own on his shoulder. "Just follow me," she whispered. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. At first, he was clumsy, his heavy boots scuffing the wooden floor. He nearly trod on her feet twice, but she was patient, her body guiding his, her low humming the only sound in the room. Slowly, he began to relax. He started to feel the rhythm, the gentle sway of the music. He was holding a woman in his arms, not out of passion or necessity, but in a simple, graceful gesture of connection. And for a few short minutes, the stone around his heart began to crack. Ada, unable to sleep, had come to the cabin for a drink of water. She saw them through the open doorway, bathed in the warm lantern light. Calder, his face a mask of concentration, his arm around her cousin's waist. Maybelle, her head tilted, a soft smile on her lips as she guided him. They were turning slowly, a small island of grace in the vast, harsh wilderness. The old Ada would have felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it would have drawn blood. She would have seen a rival stealing a moment that should have been hers. But she was not the old Ada. She had seen the loneliness in Maybelle's eyes. She had heard the pain in her story. She knew that her cousin was not just teaching a man to dance. She was teaching herself how to trust again. And she saw Calder. She saw the tension easing from his shoulders, the slightest softening of his stern mouth. He was taking a step, however small, out of the tomb of his grief. And she knew, with a certainty that was both painful and beautiful, that she was not the only one who could lead him out. She didn't feel anger. She felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. Without making a sound, she smiled a small, sad, knowing smile, and slipped back into the darkness. Later that night, the two women found themselves alone in the kitchen, a pot of chamomile tea brewing on the stove. Calder had long since retreated to the barn, leaving the cabin to them. An unspoken agreement had formed that this was their space after dark. "I saw you," Ada said softly, pouring the tea into 2 tin cups. "Dancing with him." Maybelle, who had been staring out the small window into the impenetrable blackness, turned, her expression guarded. "It was nothing, just passing the time." "It wasn't nothing," Ada said, sliding a cup across the table to her. "It was good to see him, move like that, like a man, not just a monument to his own sadness." She looked at her cousin, her gaze direct and free of accusation. "And it was good to see you smile like that, a real smile, not the one you wear for customers." Maybelle was taken aback by the sincerity. She had been braced for a fight, for tears and accusations. Ada's gentle acceptance disarmed her completely. She sat down at the table, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "He's a good man, Addie," Maybelle said, her voice low. "Too good for the likes of me. And he looks at you like you're the first spring thaw after a long winter. And he looks at you like you're a shot of whiskey after a month on the trail." Ada replied with a small smile, something that reminds him he's not made of dust. They sat in silence, the truth of it settling between them. The rivalry that had simmered for weeks had finally been named and, in the naming, seemed to lose its power. They were not enemies. They were two different kinds of nourishment for the same starving man. "I love him," Ada confessed, the words a quiet whisper in the night. "I think I started to love him the night he told me about his wife, when I saw that his grief was as deep as my fear." A sad smile touched Maybelle's lips. "I don't know if I know what love is," she said, her cynicism a shield she held up out of habit. "But I know I've never met a man who made me feel safe. Not until him. And I know that when he looks at me, he doesn't just see a soiled dove, he sees a woman. And I find myself wanting to be the woman he sees." They looked at each other across the small wooden table. Two widows who had washed up on the same desolate shore. They were survivors, scarred in different ways by the same cruel world. They had both lost husbands. They had both been treated like property. And now they had both found a fragile, complicated hope in the same taciturn rancher. "We both love him," Ada said, her voice clear and steady, articulating the thought that had been forming in her heart ever since she'd seen them dancing. "We're both broken in ways he seems to understand. We both need what he can offer." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "So why, Maybelle, why must we fight? Why must we play the world's game, the one that pits us against each other for the prize of a man, only to have one of us, or maybe both of us, lose everything in the end?" Maybelle stared at her, her cousin's words striking her with the force of revelation. All her life, she had fought other women for the best song, for the wealthiest patron, for the safest position on the stage. It was the only way she knew how to survive. But Ada was offering a different path. Not a truce, but an alliance. "What are you saying?" Maybelle whispered, though she already knew. "I'm saying." Ada took a deep breath, her courage solidifying with every word. "That I would rather have half of a real home than all of a lonely one. I would rather share a good man than lose him to a choice he shouldn't have to make. A choice that would break him and break us." A radical, impossible idea began to take shape in the small, lamp-lit kitchen. It was an idea born of desperation and a strange, profound love. It defied law. It defied God. It defied every rule of civilization they had ever known. But out here, in this lonely valley, civilization was a distant rumor. All that was real was the wind, the land, and the three of them. "If he'll have us," Ada finished, her voice trembling but resolute. "Both of us." The next morning, they approached him together. He was at the corral, working with the Mustang he had been trying to break. He saw them coming, two women walking side by side, their expressions serious. And he stopped, looping the rope over the fence post. He sensed this was a conversation that would change things forever. They stopped a few feet from him, standing together as a united front. It was Ada who spoke, her voice clear and calm. "Calder," she began, "we need to talk about what happens now." He nodded, waiting. "I know. Maybelle and we have talked," she continued. "We understand the position we have put you in, and we have made a decision." He braced himself. He expected one of them to say she was leaving. He expected tears, ultimatums. He was prepared for anything but what came next. "We will not make you choose between us," Ada said. Maybelle spoke then, her voice firm, stripped of all artifice. "Because we have already chosen. We choose to stay, here, with you." Calder stared at them, confused. "I don't understand." "We want to build a life here," Ada said, her gaze unwavering. "The three of us, together, as a family." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back a step, his mind reeling, unable to process the sheer audacity of what they were proposing. He looked from Ada's earnest, hopeful face to Maybelle's steady, challenging one. They were serious. You can't mean that," he stammered. That's impossible. People don't live like that." "We do," Maybelle said simply. "It's a sin," he finally burst out, the ingrained morality of a lifetime rising up in a wave of shock and disbelief. "It's against God's law. A man has one wife, one. Anything else it's an abomination." He was a man of the earth, of simple truths and hard lines. The world was divided into right and wrong, black and white. What they were suggesting was a shade of gray so deep he couldn't even comprehend it. It was chaos. It was madness. "Is your God in this valley?" "Calder," Maybelle asked, her voice quiet but sharp as a razor. "Does he comfort you when the wind howls like a ghost? Does he keep you warm when the loneliness is so cold it freezes the marrow in your bones?" "This isn't about God. It's about what's right," he insisted, his voice rising, pleading with them to see reason. "It's unnatural." "What's unnatural?" Ada said, her voice filled with a passion he had never heard from her. "Is a good man wasting away in his grief. What's unnatural is two women who have found a safe harbor being forced to tear each other apart for it. What we feel in this house, the three of us, it might be complicated, and it might be messy, but it is not a sin. It is the truest thing I have ever known." Calder was stunned into silence. His mind was a battlefield. The rigid principles he had lived by clashing with the undeniable truth of his own heart. He looked at them, at these two women who had brought his dead world back to life, who had filled his silent house with laughter and arguments and dancing and the smell of baking bread. To send one away would be like tearing out a part of his own soul. To keep them both, it was a thought so monstrous, so forbidden, that he could not allow it to take root. He shook his head, a gesture of final, desperate refusal. "No," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "I can't. We can't." He turned his back on them, unable to face the radical hope in their eyes. He gripped the top rail of the corral fence, his knuckles turning white, and stared out at the unforgiving land that had always been his only real companion. Ada and Maybelle didn't argue. They didn't plead or cry. They simply stood there, together, their silence a more powerful response than any words could ever be. It was a silence that said, "We have made our choice. Now you must live with yours." Calder's refusal hung in the air for days, a palpable thing as cold and hard as a winter stone. He threw himself into his work with a grim, punishing intensity, as if he could physically exhaust the conflict that was tearing him apart. He spoke only when necessary. He ate what was put before him. He slept in the barn. He had drawn a line, not in the dirt, but through the heart of their fragile home. He had chosen the world's rules over the evidence of his own soul, and the choice was hollowing him out. Ada and Maybelle did not press him. They met his silence with their own quiet resolve. They had made their declaration, and now they simply waited. They continued their work, maintaining the rhythms of the ranch, a united front of quiet dignity. But their alliance had subtly shifted. They were no longer just two women clinging to one man. They were partners in a silent siege against the fortress of his fear. The world outside, however, was not content to wait. The bounty hunter Finch, as good as his word, had carried his story back to the town of redemption. He had painted a lurid, venomous picture, the lone widower. Reed, living in sin with not one, but two women, one a runaway wife, the other a painted harlot. The story, seasoned with the righteous indignation of a man who had been shot, spread like a fever. The whispers began. When Calder rode into Redemption for salt and flour a week after the shooting, the change was immediate and chilling. The usual friendly nods from fellow ranchers were replaced with hard stares. Men on the boardwalk would stop talking as he passed, their silence a loud accusation. In the general store, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had known him since he was a boy, served him without meeting his eye. Her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. He was no longer just a grieving recluse. He was a pariah. The most formal condemnation arrived by way of the mail rider. It was a letter, sealed with wax, from Reverend Michael Miller, the town's spiritual shepherd. Calder opened it that evening in the barn, his hands grimy with dirt and axle grease. The Reverend's script was elegant, but the words were a lash. Mr. Reed, it is with a heavy heart and a profound sense of Christian duty that I write to you. Tidings have reached my ears of a most grievous and unnatural living arrangement at your ranch. While I pray these rumors are the product of malicious gossip, my conscience compels me to address them. You are a man who has known profound loss, and the Lord understands the temptations that arise from a lonely heart. But the path you are rumored to be walking is one of moral turpitude, an affront to the sanctity of marriage and a flagrant violation of God's holy law. Thou shalt not commit adultery. The Lord commands, and to harbor another man's wife, let alone to live in such a shameful state with two women, is to invite damnation upon your soul and scandal upon our community. I implore you, as your pastor, to cast out this darkness. Send these women away. Repent your sins before the eyes of God and man. The doors of my church are open to you, but they can only welcome a soul that seeks redemption, not one that wallows in depravity. May God have mercy on you. In his name, Reverend M. Miller. Calder crumpled the letter in his fist. Every word was a brand, searing the very beliefs he had used to deny Ada and Maybelle. He was caught in a trap of his own making. The world he was trying to appease was now condemning him for a sin he hadn't even had the courage to commit. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. He was damned if he did, and damned if he didn't. The world's judgment did not remain confined to whispers and letters. It came for them on a moonless night a few days later. They were asleep, Calder in the hayloft, the women in their respective beds in the stable and the cabin, when a flicker of unnatural orange light danced against the walls. Then came the smell, acrid smoke. Calder was awake instantly, his senses screaming. He looked out the hayloft door and his blood ran cold. The cattle barn, the larger structure that housed his small herd and the winter feed, was ablaze. Tongues of fire licked up the dry timber walls, roaring into the night sky. And in the demonic, flickering light, he saw them, a group of half a dozen riders, their faces obscured by scarves, torches in their hands. A primal roar of fury and despair tore from his throat. This was his life, his work, his future, all of it turning to ash before his eyes. He scrambled down the ladder, grabbing a heavy pitchfork. There was no time for a gun. His only thought was of the animals trapped inside. He could hear their terrified, high-pitched bellows over the crackle of the flames. He charged towards the barn, a wild man fueled by pure rage. "Get out of there!" he screamed at the cattle. Wrenching open the main gate, a few terrified steers stampeded out, their eyes wide with panic. The riders, who had been about to leave, turned at his approach. They had expected to deliver their warning to an empty yard. They had not expected a fight. "That's far enough! Reed!" one of them shouted, his voice a nervous bark. "This is a warning! Get rid of them whores!" Calder didn't stop. He lunged at the nearest rider, using the pitchfork to shove the man clean off his horse. The others reacted instantly. They dismounted, surrounding him. He swung the heavy pitchfork, a desperate, cornered animal, keeping them at bay for a few precious seconds. But the odds were impossible. One man came up from behind, swinging a thick piece of lumber that caught Calder squarely in the back of his knees, sending him crashing to the ground. The pitchfork flew from his grasp. They were on him in an instant, their boots and fists a merciless storm of punishment. He curled into a ball, trying to protect his head and stomach, the taste of blood and dirt filling his mouth. A boot connected with his ribs, and he felt a sharp, sickening crack. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded behind his eyes. He heard their grunts of exertion, their muttered curses, and the roar of the fire, which seemed to be consuming the entire world. From the cabin porch, Ada and Maybelle watched in frozen horror. Maybelle held Ada back, her nails digging into her arm. "No, they'll kill you too," she hissed, her voice tight with terror. They could do nothing but watch as the man who was their entire world was beaten into the dust. The assault ended as abruptly as it had begun. The riders, their grim work done, mounted their horses and galloped away into the darkness, leaving behind a burning barn, a dying fire of a home, and a broken man. As soon as they were gone, the women ran to him. He was a crumpled heap on the ground, barely conscious. The fire was raging now, beyond any hope of being saved. The roof timbers groaned and then collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of sparks into the night sky. The barn was lost. All they could do was save the man. Between them, they managed to drag him, limp and groaning, into the cabin. They laid him on his own bed, the bed he hadn't slept in for weeks. The sight of him in the lamplight was terrifying. His face was a swollen, bloody mask. His shirt was torn, revealing a massive, darkening bruise on his chest. Every breath was a shallow, ragged gasp of pain. For the rest of that long, terrible night, they worked to save him. The rivalry that had once defined their relationship was burned away in the fires of that barn, reduced to the ash of a shared, desperate love. They moved around each other in a seamless, silent dance of healing. Ada, with her knowledge of herbs, prepared a poultice of comfrey and yarrow to draw out the swelling. Maybelle, with a pragmatism born of 100 back-alley brawls, cleaned his wounds with whiskey, her touch surprisingly gentle as she wiped the blood from his split lip and battered brow. They took turns holding a cool, wet cloth to his head, whispering words of comfort he couldn't hear. They set his ribs as best they could, wrapping his torso in strips of clean linen torn from Ada's embroidered dress. The image of her tiny, hopeful flowers being used to bind his broken body was a tragedy so profound they couldn't speak of it. Through the long hours before dawn, they kept their vigil. Two women from two different worlds, united in their fierce, protective devotion to the man who lay broken between them. He drifted in and out of a fog of pain. He was vaguely aware of cool hands on his brow, of a gentle voice urging him to drink water, of the sharp, clean smell of herbs. When he finally surfaced into something resembling consciousness, the morning sun was streaming through the cabin window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He tried to sit up, but a pain so sharp and blinding shot through his ribs that he fell back with a groan, his vision swimming. "Easy, Calder, lie still," a voice said. He blinked, and Ada's face swam into view. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, her face pale, but her expression was one of profound relief. On the other side of the bed, Maybelle stood, holding a basin of water, her face a mask of grim determination. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of smoke, blood, and medicinal herbs. The memory of the fire, of the fists and boots, came rushing back. He saw the ruins of Ada's embroidery on the table, torn into bandages. He saw the exhaustion etched on their faces. He saw the way they stood together, a united front of weary angels who had pulled him back from the brink. And he was consumed by a wave of failure so immense it was worse than the physical pain. He had promised them safety. He had brought them nothing but ruin. His barn was gone. His body was broken. And his name was mud in the only town he had ever called home. "You should have gone," he rasped, his voice a dry, painful croak. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a deep, aching despair. "You should have left me when you had the chance. Why didn't you go? You both deserve better than this. A better place, a better man." Ada took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked not at him, but through him, to the very heart of the matter that had tormented them for weeks. "We don't need a better place. Calder," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength he had never heard before. "We need a real place, a place where we don't have to hide who we are, or what we feel, a place where we aren't someone's property or someone's secret." She squeezed his hand. "This is the only place that has ever felt real. I am not leaving." Maybelle stepped forward, placing the basin on the nightstand. She dipped a cloth in the water and began to gently wipe the dried blood from his temple. Her movements were steady, her gaze intense. "She's right," Maybelle said, her voice stripped of all its usual cynicism, raw and true. "I've spent my whole life in better places, places with velvet curtains and fancy chandeliers, and every one of them was a lie. Every smile was paid for. Every kind word had a price." She met his gaze, her eyes blazing with a fierce conviction. "What we have here, it's dangerous, and it's crazy, and the whole world thinks it's wrong." She paused, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But if this love is wrong, at least it's not a lie like everything out there." Their words fell into the quiet room, dismantling the last of his defenses, the rigid structure of right and wrong, of God's law and man's judgment, the very things his attackers had beaten into him. All of it crumbled to dust. What was a sin, a word in a book? A condemnation from the mouths of hypocrites who preached piety in the daylight and burned down barns in the dark? Or was sin leaving a woman to the mercy of a man like Croft? Was sin letting loneliness and grief consume a man's soul? Was sin turning your back on the only real, honest love you had ever known, simply because it didn't fit the shape the world demanded? He looked from Ada's steadfast, gentle face to Maybelle's fierce, loyal one. He saw the women who had nursed him, who had bound his wounds with their own hopes, who had refused to abandon him even when it meant their own destruction. They had answered his weakness with their strength. They had answered his doubt with their faith. They had chosen him, unequivocally and without reservation. The war inside him was over. In the crucible of fire and pain, all that was left was the truth. Slowly, painfully, he raised his hands. He took Ada's hand in his left and Maybelle's in his right. He looked from one to the other, and the look in his eyes was different. The conflict was gone. The desperation was gone. In their place was a look of profound, solemn commitment. For the first time, he was not looking at them as his saviors, his temptations, or his problem. He was looking at them with the eyes of a husband. It took a week for him to be able to stand, another for him to walk without the world spinning. Through it all, they cared for him, their presence a constant, reassuring warmth. They did not speak again of their proposal. They didn't have to. The answer was in every touch, every shared glance. On the evening of the first full moon after the fire, Calder, leaning heavily on a carved stick, led them out of the cabin. He took them past the charred, skeletal remains of the barn, a monument to the life he was leaving behind. He led them up the gentle slope of a hill that overlooked the entire valley. The ground was dotted with stubborn, resilient wildflowers, their colors muted in the pale, silvery light of the moon. There, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the sky, they stopped. There was no church, no preacher, no congregation. Their only witnesses were the silent, ancient mountains and the wind that whispered through the sagebrush. Calder turned to face them, his battered face serious in the moonlight. He still held their hands. "I have no ring to give you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have no fine house. What I had, they burned. All I have is this land, and a heart that you two have brought back from the dead." He looked at Ada. "Ada, Fairchild, you came here seeking safety, and you taught me what it means to be strong. Your gentleness is a courage I have never known. Will you have me as I am, broken and stubborn and all?" Ada's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I will, Calder Reed," she whispered. with all my heart." Then he turned to Maybelle. "Maybelle, you came here seeking shelter, and you taught me what it means to be alive. Your fire has burned away my ghosts. Will you have me as I am, flawed and foolish and all?" Maybelle's usual sharp wit had deserted her. Her painted lips trembled, and her voice was thick when she spoke. "I will, Calder. God help me, I will." Then he looked at them both, his grip tightening on their hands. "I, Calder Reed, take you, Ada, and you, Maybelle, to be my family. I promise to honor you, to protect you, and to stand by you against any storm and any fire. I give you my name, my home, and my heart. All of it, to both of you, before this land and under this sky. This is my vow." They did not recite vows of their own. They simply stepped forward, one on each side, and leaned their heads against his shoulders. And there they stood, 3 solitary figures on a barren hill, bound by a promise that no law would recognize and no church would bless, but which was as sacred and unbreakable as the earth beneath their feet. They were a family, forged in violence, consecrated under the moon, a defiant, impossible truth in the heart of the unforgiving West. 1 year, a single turn of the seasons, but in the high, lonesome valley, it was a lifetime. The land itself seemed to have healed alongside its inhabitants. The skeletal, black timbers of the burned-out barn had been cleared away, and in its place stood a new one, smaller but sturdier, its fresh-cut pine smelling of resilience and stubborn hope. The fences that had been neglected were now strung tight, enclosing a herd of longhorns that had doubled in number, their calves fat and healthy. And Ada's vegetable garden, once a trampled ruin, was now a riot of life. Lush green beans climbed tall poles, heavy red tomatoes hung from their vines, and golden squash sprawled in the sun. The ranch was no longer a place of hiding, but a place of thriving. The life within the cabin had found its own rhythm, a quiet, 3-part harmony. Calder was still a man of few words, but the hard, brittle silence of his grief had been replaced by a deep, contented quiet. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by the steady, watchful gaze of a man who knew what he was protecting. Maybelle was the music of the household. She still sang her saloon ballads, but they were different now. Stripped of the desperate need to please a paying crowd, her voice held a new, soulful quality. They were no longer the songs of a caged bird, but the free, clear notes of a meadowlark at dusk, sung for no one but her family and the vast, listening sky. And Ada was the heart. She moved through their home with a serene, quiet grace. The fear that had once shadowed her every step vanished completely. She was the steady presence, the warm bread from the oven, the mended shirt, the gentle hand. And now, she carried the future. Her belly had begun to swell with the gentle, unmistakable curve of new life. She was carrying Calder's child, a testament to their impossible union, a seed of hope planted in the most unforgiving soil. The town of Redemption had not forgotten them, but the nature of its memory had changed. The initial storm of outrage had faded, replaced by a grudging, baffled curiosity. The pariahs on the Reed Ranch had not, as expected, destroyed each other in a blaze of sin and jealousy. They had not starved. They had not fled. Instead, by all accounts, they had worked. They had rebuilt. They had endured. The official test of this new reality came in the late spring, when the wildflowers were in full bloom. A buggy carrying Sheriff Hatcher and, to their surprise, Reverend Miller himself made its slow way up the long track to the ranch. It was not a raid, but an inspection, a formal visit to confront the scandal that still clung to their small community's conscience. The 3 of them were in the yard when the buggy arrived. Calder was repairing a harness, his hands strong and sure. Ada was hanging laundry on a line, her swollen belly a gentle silhouette against the bright morning. Maybelle was feeding the chickens, her auburn hair glinting in the sun. They saw the buggy coming, and a silent, tense understanding passed between them. They did not run. They did not hide. They simply waited. Sheriff Hatcher, a portly man whose authority rested on a carefully maintained sense of order, cleared his throat as he stepped down from the buggy. The Reverend followed, his face a grim mask of pastoral duty. "Read," the sheriff began, his tone attempting a sternness that didn't quite hold. "We've come on. Official business." "I can see that, Sheriff," Calder said, his voice calm. He didn't rise from his work, but his hands stilled. "What can I do for you?" Reverend Miller stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the scene, clearly expecting to find a den of squalor and depravity. What he saw instead was a scene of almost aggressively wholesome domesticity. The neat cabin, the thriving garden, the clean laundry flapping in the breeze. He looked at Ada, at her pregnant form, and a flush of righteous anger colored his cheeks. "Mr. Reed," the Reverend began, his voice ringing with practiced condemnation. "The good Lord sees all. You have persisted in this shameful arrangement, bringing a child into a house of sin. As a man of God, I must demand that you dissolve this unholy union, that you send one of these women away and make an honest woman of the other." Before Calder could speak, Maybelle straightened up from scattering the chicken feed. She looked the Reverend directly in the eye, her own gaze as sharp and unyielding as his. "Reverend," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the yard, devoid of its usual drawl. "Do you see any unhappiness here? Do you see squalor? Do you see a child that will be unwanted or uncared for?" She gestured around the yard with a sweep of her hand. "You see a home that has been rebuilt with hard work. You see a family that has found peace where there was only pain. If your God is a God of love, surely he would not wish to destroy that." The Reverend was momentarily speechless, taken aback by her direct, unshakable confidence. He had expected a cowering sinner, not a clear-eyed philosopher. Sheriff Hatcher, a more practical man, stepped in. His eyes weren't on their souls, but on the law. He looked at Calder. "Son, the law's the law. A man can't be married to two women." "Who said anything about marriage?" "Sheriff," Calder replied, finally looking up from the harness. His gaze was level, devoid of fear or apology. "These are the Weber sisters, my hired help. I gave them a place to stay when they had nowhere else to go, and they've earned their keep and then some. Ada, she was a widow with child, and I took her in. It was a lie, but it was a lie spoken with the force of truth. Is there a law against that? A law against helping those in need?" The sheriff was stymied. There was no law against hiring help. There was no law against giving shelter to a pregnant widow. Finch's story had been about a man living with two wives, a tale of debauchery. The reality before him was work and life, and a calm that was deeply unsettling to his black and white view of the world. He looked at the two women. They were dressed simply. They were working. They did not look like concubines. They looked like pioneers. He looked at the new barn, the healthy cattle, the solid fences. He saw a ranch that was better run now than it had been when Calder Reed was alone and respectable. He saw progress, not sin. He turned to the Reverend. "There's no crime here. Reverend, it's unusual, but it ain't illegal." He tipped his hat to the women, a gesture of grudging respect. Ma'am. He then looked at Calder. "Reed, stay out of trouble." He climbed back into the buggy, leaving the Reverend standing alone in the yard, his moral crusade defeated by the simple, unassailable fact of a well-run home. Reverend Miller, with one last, frustrated look at the baffling trinity before him, followed the sheriff into the buggy, and they departed, leaving the Reed Ranch in a cloud of dust and quiet victory. That visit marked the turning point. The town still gossiped, but the venom was gone, replaced by a kind of myth-making. The Reed place became a local legend. They were that strange family up on the ridge, a curiosity, a testament to the peculiar things that could happen in the isolation of the West. Riders would sometimes go out of their way to pass by, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man with 2 wives. What they saw was a man mending a roof, a pregnant woman weeding a garden, and another woman singing to a herd of goats. The reality was always far more boring and far more profound than the stories. They were no longer pariahs, but part of the landscape, as strange and accepted as a twisted old juniper tree that had somehow managed to grow from solid rock. One day, late in the summer, another rider approached the ranch. He was not a bounty hunter or a preacher. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with the gaunt, hunted look of someone who had seen too much hardship and not enough food. His horse was lame, and his clothes were little more than rags. He dismounted at the gate, holding his hat in his hands, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Calder met him there. "Can I help you?" "Sir," the boy stammered, "my name is Jeb. I was told you might have need of a hired hand. I can work, I can ride, I can rope, I can mend fences. I'll do anything. I just need a place." Calder studied him. He saw the desperation, but he also saw a core of honesty in the boy's eyes. "Where'd you hear I was hiring?" Jeb looked down at his feet, scuffing the dirt. "In town, they talk about you, sir. They say a lot of things." He looked up, his gaze earnest. "They say you're a sinner, but they also say you're a fair man. And they say you run a place where people, well, where they mind their own business." He took a breath, the words coming out in a rush. "Sir, I've been on ranches where the foreman talks about God on Sunday and cheats you out of your wages on Monday. I've seen decent folk do indecent things. I don't care what they say about you." He looked towards the cabin, where the faint sound of Maybelle's singing could be heard. "If this is a place where a man can just be true and do a hard day's work for a fair meal, I'd like to try it." Calder looked at the boy for a long moment. He saw a reflection of himself, of Ada, of Maybelle, another soul looking for a real place in a world full of lies. He saw the first sign that what they were building was not just a home for themselves, but perhaps a beacon for others. He nodded slowly. "The bunkhouse is out back. There's stew on the stove. Work starts at sunrise." Jeb's face broke into a grin of pure, unadulterated relief. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The sun was setting, painting the vast western sky in strokes of fiery orange, deep violet, and soft, buttery yellow. It was the end of another day, another season, another year of their impossible life. The air was cool and smelled of dust and pine and the coming autumn. Calder sat on the top step of the porch, his back against the post, his long legs stretched out. The hard lines on his face had been softened by time and contentment. He was no longer the ghost who haunted this ranch, but its anchor, its heartwood. Ada sat to his right, her head resting on his shoulder. Her belly was large and round now. The baby due any day. Her hand rested on it, a gesture of protective, peaceful love. Maybelle sat to his left, her head resting on his other shoulder. Her hand was intertwined with his. Her fingers, once adorned with cheap rings, now bare and calloused from work. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear behind the jagged black teeth of the mountains. A single, bright star appeared in the darkening sky. The world was vast and empty and beautiful, and in the center of it all was their small, quiet porch. They were an island of tranquility in an endless sea. It was Ada who finally broke the silence, her voice a soft murmur against his shoulder. "Calder," she said, "in another life, if there is such a thing, would you choose us again?" It was the last, lingering question, the final ghost of doubt. Had their life been a choice born of desperation, a second-best compromise? Or had it been a destiny they had stumbled into? Calder didn't answer right away. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of land and sky. He thought of the man he had been, A man so consumed by loss he had been begging for the end. He thought of the two women who had washed up on his shore and had, against all odds, taught him how to live again, how to love again. Not just once, but twice over. He thought of the fire, the pain, the rebuilding. He thought of the child sleeping in Ada's womb, a future he had never dared to dream of. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire countenance. He squeezed Maybelle's hand and pulled Ada a little closer. "In another life," he said, his voice low and certain, filled with a love as vast as the sky above them. "I'd have found you both sooner." The last of the light faded, leaving them in the gentle, silver glow of the rising moon. The wind whispered through the eaves of the cabin, a soft, lonesome lullaby. It was a home like no other in the world, a family understood by no one, that is, except the three people who lived there. And for them, it was everything. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and sharing your thoughts on this tale.